Good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming tonight. My name is Larry Brill. I'm with the EPA Superfund program out of Boston. Tonight is the second night in a three-part series explaining PCBs in the Housatonic River. For those of you who couldn't come last night or may not be able to come tomorrow night, all three nights will be on the Housatonicworkshop.org website. In fact, I just found out last night's session is already on there with the speakers. So if you missed that, you can, as long as you have a computer, you can get on the internet and hear that and the Q&As. We thought last night went very well. It was an excellent turnout, a good meeting. There's a lot of good Q&A. At the end of this, for those who came last night, unfortunately, you'll have to bear with me for a few sort of common points from the same nights. When I finish, Steve Shapiro of Certus will talk about the Q&A process for this meeting. It's a little different, but how it'll work with the four speakers. And with that, I'd like to just go over a little background of how these mini workshops were decided and what the goals are and the expectations. GE submitted their revised corrective measure studies in October of 2010. That was after they submitted their original and had been commented on. The informal public input process to that document was closed in January 31st. EPA's consultants then had a series of interviews with the shareholders over the last few months regarding their views on the process. Out of that outcome, the thought was that a series of mini workshops would be really helpful to sort of explain where EPA is, what the CMS said, and about next steps. And the outcome of this three-day mini workshop will be a charrette on May 7th. A charrette is going to be, which we'll get to at the very end, a process where the public has much more input into what they would like to see as an outcome for this process. So out of this meeting tonight, we're hoping to provide the community with an understanding of the work that EPA and others have done on the rest of the river, an understanding of how the river works and how it's affected by PCB contamination, and an opportunity to answer any questions. And I said Steve will explain. If we don't answer them tonight, we'll either answer them tomorrow or we'll answer it on the web. Again, the results, the stakeholders should have a better understanding tonight of the issues associated with any cleanup plan for the river. And EPA is in the process of finalizing a cleanup plan for the river. It's been a long time coming. You know, it hopefully will be done by the end of our fiscal year. And we're looking forward to the charrette in May to get more input from the public on what they would like to see the cleanup plan to be. Last night, the workshop was on why working with the river process matters. Tonight, it's more on getting the facts about PCBs, how they travel in the river system, how they affect humans, how they affect the ecosystem, and what are PCBs. And then tomorrow night, we'll be exploring alternatives on the cleanup. I think one piece that we have to sort of explain is that we have EPA has certain decision criteria that has to be used. Part of that is getting input from the stakeholders, which is obviously everyone in the area. GE's revised CMS study, which is sort of the basis for us making our decision. And then the 9 criteria which are specified in the record permit. I just want to mention those criteria because we have to consider those and comply with them to the max extent practicable. Well, number 1 is overall protection of human health and the environment. Number 2 is control of sources of releases. And 3 is compliance with applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements. And that means complying with other federal requirements like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. Other decision factors are long-term reliability and effectiveness of the remedy, attainment of IMPGs, the interim cleanup goals, reduction of toxicity, mobility, and volume, short-term effectiveness of the cleanup, and implementability and cost. For tonight's agenda, there'll be 4 speakers, and this is for you to get a better understanding of the issues related to PCBs. Last night we talked about what is a PCB, how it's formed, how it lasts in the environment, and what its impacts are. Tonight we're going to be talking about how PCBs are, the distribution of fate of PCBs in the river, the human health risks from PCBs, the ecological impact risks from PCBs, and then modeling of PCBs in the Housatonic River. The goal, again, is for the community to understand how PCBs may be impacting the Housatonic River and the risk they cause to people and animals. Again, the last piece of this is on May 7th is an all-day a charrette, which is really EPA looking for the public to put input into what their long-term goals of the river and what they want to see of the river. So this session is really EPA trying to, with this technical experts and EPA staff, explain what the impacts and what some of the issues are with the river. And on the charrette, it's really looking for the public to come up with what ideas they have of what they would like to see for the final outcome of the river. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Shapiro, who can explain the questions and answers.
Thank you, Larry. Welcome, everyone, again. Just for a show of hands, how many people were here last night? Great. Thank you for coming back. And for those who are here for the first time, thank you. Again, what Larry said, I don't want to, it seems there's a lot of people who were here last night. You have the workbook when you came in. The 2 pagers in there are going to mirror the PowerPoints that are going to be up on the screen. In the middle as an insert in the workbook, there's a blue sheet and a yellow sheet. We appreciate the feedback we got last night. We would ask you again for your feedback, your comments. If you haven't registered for the charrette that Larry mentioned, and Kathy Poole, who hopefully you had an opportunity to meet and do the exercise with her outside, that you'll register for the charrette tonight or register on the website, www.housatonicworkshops.org. And as Larry also said, that website is really just up for purposes of, through this outreach effort, it's going to house the film, the video from last night and each evening. It will house the workbooks, a lot of the fact sheets that have been produced and studied and researched over the last 12 years, as well as another wealth of information. And again, the registration for the charrette is on the website. Let me go over the question process again. The yellow sheet that's in your workbook, we ask that you write legibly. Some of the questions for folks, you know, from last night I had a hard time reading. If you could print relatively large, 1 question per section, and we will do our best to get to every question timely. If your question isn't asked right away, it means that it may be more appropriate for all the panelists to discuss at the end. And for some reason, if it's not answered at all, it will be answered through the website as well, through Q&A. If you run out of yellow sheets, please raise a hand. There's plenty of yellow sheets to go around, plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions, give your comments. So with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, our first speaker. Ed Garland is a senior professional associate for HDR Hydroqual in Mahwah, New Jersey. Ed is an environmental engineer with 30 years of experience in water and sediment quality modeling, including over 25 years with Hydroqual, Inc. He serves as the technical director of the modeling program within Hydroqual, including having spent 25 years in that role with Hydroqual. He has his advanced degrees from Manhattan College, and I welcome Ed Garland.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And thanks for coming. I'm glad that so many of you were here last night because you heard talks last night about processes active in the river and the behavior of PCBs once they're released in the river. So we'll really build on that in this talk. As we try and understand what is affecting the distribution of PCBs and the fate and transport, we pull together different processes that we think are important in affecting that. And we call it a conceptual site model. And they're often depicted in cartoonish-like images like this. But really what they're trying to do is just list all the processes that we think might be affecting the distribution, the fate and transport of PCBs, and it sort of helps organize the collection of data so that data are collected that inform us about the importance and the relative importance of different processes. You heard last night how when PCBs are released into the environment, they tend to absorb to particulates. So the transport of suspended solids, the erosion of bed solids, are very important in affecting or controlling the distribution, fate, and transport of PCBs. So those are processes for which we collect data, and they help us understand just what's happening. In this system, there is a lot of conditions at high flow conditions where the water goes out onto the floodplain. So there's transport of PCBs from the river, from the bottom, from the banks of the river, out farther onto the floodplain. So that's an important process. We see settling and erosion. We see bed load of sand-type particles, which is more important in some parts of the system and less important in others. So the conceptual site model helps us try and tie all these things together. We look at the physical setting. This is a depiction of the slope of the riverbed as we move from the confluence of the east and west branches downriver, in this case, through Woods Pond. And the river was broken up into subreaches that are based on the physical characteristics present there. In Reach 5A, the bed slope is steeper. The bed is comprised of particles that are bigger, sand particles, gravel particles. The velocities are faster there. The riverbanks are eroding more there than in other places. There's not as many meanders there. As we move, the break point between 5A and 5B is the wastewater treatment plant. And downstream of the treatment plant, we start to see more meanders. There's a sort of a transition zone there from the coarser type sediment in 5A to muddier sediments moving down to 5C. And that break point is at Roaring Brook. The dam at Woods Pond makes a backwater, like a pond. Well, the pond extends beyond what is physically referred to as the pond, and the velocities are affected by, pardon me, by that backwater. The velocities get slower as you move downstream of New Lenox Road in through 5C. The river gets wider. You have the backwater areas. So all those things affect the fate and the distribution of PCBs. The pond itself, it's a very quiescent area, so material that comes in, it's a shallow system. Some of it will settle, some of it will go over Woods Pond Dam. If we look at the next section of the river downstream of Woods Pond Dam, referred to as Reaches 7 and 8, and Reach 8 is Rising Pond, we see very different character than in Reaches 5 and 6. There are impoundments in Reach 7, and Columbia Mill Dam, Glendale Dam, Willow Mill Dam, and each of those have the same effect of backwatering the river behind them, but there are much longer sections in Reach 7 where the river is running faster, almost like just runs between pools, and that has a different character, and it affects the distribution of PCBs down there. Much bigger bed slopes, especially in that section upstream of Rising Pond, between Glendale Dam and Rising Pond, you see very steep bed slope, and the cobble bed down there is very different than in places where it's a shallower slope, muddier sediments, which tend to accumulate PCBs much more so. In order to understand where the PCBs are, how they're moving around, a tremendous amount of data were collected. And data of various types to understand how the water is moving and the way that a flood wave moves through the system. Measurements of river stage were collected at a lot of places. And you can do that with instrumentation that's in place. So you get readings every 15 minutes or so, and that's why we can have over 80,000 measurements of river flow that come from the stage measurements at different places. But you see that suspended solids in the water column, we have thousands of measurements of suspended solids, and they're collected under different conditions. different sampling programs were designed to go out and measure conditions when the river flow is high, during normal conditions. PCBs are measured in the water column, less so than the suspended solids because they're more expensive, but in this case, we still have over 1,000 measurements of PCBs in the water. In the floodplain soils, over 4,000 measurements. The biota, over 5,000 in the floodplain, 4,000 in the sediment. In biota, over 5,000 measurements. So a very rich data set to help us understand how PCBs are moving and where they are in this system. An interesting aspect and unique aspect of the river is up in 5A in the upper part of 5B, there are many places where the river banks are eroding. And we can see cases where bank soil has fallen into the river. Now, some of that soil can be eroded just with the continuous flow of water. But sometimes there can be a condition where a big chunk fails, a mass failure of bank soil. And some of that will deposit right at the toe of the bank, and some of it will be transported away. So the bank themselves have PCBs in them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that is a source of solids moving in the system and of PCBs introduced into the water. If we look at aerial photographs at different time periods, this is a section of the river just below New Lenox Road. And on the left is typical conditions. The river is in bank. And you can see the meanders there. An aerial photograph flown after, or taken after Hurricane Bertha in 1990 shows the muddy water extending out over the floodplain, so connecting all those areas between the meanders. And as that water moves out onto the floodplain, it carries PCBs with it. The solids deposit and deposit PCBs along with them. This is a picture taken following a high flow in October of 2005. And you can see, or hopefully you can see, at the bottom of that section of sediment that was scraped away, there's a quarter there, just to give you a sense of the depth of sediment. So maybe there's something on the scale of near an inch of sediment accumulated from that one storm. And those solids carry PCBs up onto the floodplain. This is a depiction of PCB concentrations on the floodplain, in the floodplain soil. And you can see that on the floodplain, the concentrations are quite variable. The scale here on, oh, sorry. Used the wrong one. The scale here shows the concentration ranges associated with the different colors. So what appears as maybe a mustard and then a red represent concentrations that are between 25 and 50 and then over 50. So some very elevated concentrations on the floodplain. This is a figure taken from General Electric's remedial investigation report, and it shows PCB concentrations in different reaches, averages, with depth in the sediment. So along the bottom, we see the different reaches labeled there. And you might not be able to read it, but within each of these reaches, there's an indication of the average concentration of PCBs in a depth interval, 0 to 6 inches, 6 to 12, and so forth, down to 3 feet. And the black dots represent the median concentration, and the top of the box represents the average concentration, and then there's a vertical bar that shows the confidence interval on the mean. But you can see in Reach 5A, for instance, those values are over 20 parts per million in most cases, and they go down 3 feet. Now, the reason you might wonder why the median concentrations are less than the means, and that's because of the variability in the concentrations. And take a simple example. If you had 3 measurements, 1, 10, and 100, well, the median of those 3 is 10. But the mean of those concentrations is 37. So you...
Sorry, for those of us who aren't as well educated about the levels and what is bad and what is acceptable, could you at some point just mention that 20 is unacceptable or characterize
That will come out in some of the later presentations.
And how do we evaluate what we're looking at now?
Let me just, it's a good question, and I don't want to stuff it. I mean, it is a good question. And Ed, think about it and do what you need to do. But I just, in general, for everyone, we're trying to get questions in writing, trying to let the speakers give as much information as they can. So if anyone does have a question, again, put it in writing, put it in comment. We'll try to get to it right away. And I understand that was burning and it needed to get asked.
And it's a complicated, the answer to it is not very simple, so that's why I'm not trying to jump in right now. But let's continue with this slide, and we'll look at, we see variations to some degree between the sub-reaches. So reach 5B, for instance, has lower concentrations than 5A. 5C has elevated concentrations at the surface. They drop off a little bit with depth. Woods Pond has very high concentrations relative to 5B and 5C. And then downstream of Woods Pond, we see in Reach 7 lower concentrations, and those are the sections primarily that have the faster moving water. And then in Reach 8, Rising Pond, we see concentrations back up, and there's some indication of higher concentrations at depth there. But now these are the averages in a depth interval, but over a whole reach. Let's look at the individual data and how variable they are. So these data now are plotted on a log scale. So the concentrations on the y-axis are shown here, 0.1, 1, 10, 100, and 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. And on the horizontal axis, it's the river miles, starting at the confluence and moving down through Woods Pond. And you can see how variable in very short distances, concentrations vary easily 2 orders of magnitude, a factor of 100 difference. And that, as we saw in the reach averages, 5A is higher, 5B is a little bit lower. 5C, there's gradients in the concentration through the reach, so that average is the average of the lower values at the upper end, and then higher values heading towards Woods Pond. So very variable concentrations over small spatial scales. But we ask ourselves, when you see places where the concentrations are up there in the high tens of milligrams per kilogram or even over 100, do those represent hotspots that could be addressed without, where you would get a big impact of going in and taking care of a very small area? And a sampling program was conducted where 12 samples were conducted from each of a number of stations, and the samples were collected over the spatial extent of about the size of a desktop. And they are shown here, and you can see the variation in concentrations. In most cases, they vary by a factor of 50 to 100 within that spatial scale of a desktop. So that tells us that any place where a single high value was collected in the bigger, larger extent characterization sampling, we don't know that right next to it the concentration might be factor of 10 lower, factor of 100 lower. So it tells us that we really don't have hotspots here. There's just a lot of variability. If we look in depth in the sediment, we see that this plot is showing us with depth at different locations from upstream to downstream were PCB concentrations detected. And the colored or the filled in represent where PCB concentrations were detected, and then the ones that are hollow are non-detects. But we see in general PCB levels detected 5 or 6 feet below the surface of the sediment. So it tells us there's a large volume of sediment there that is contaminated. Well, do we think that that PCB contaminated sediment might just get buried over time? One of the things that was looked at to evaluate whether or not there's accumulation of cleaner sediment, or we actually just sediment without even getting into how contaminated the material might be, surveys were done across the river, just looking at the bed elevation as you go across the river, and see how that bed elevation changes over time. Those same cross-sections were revisited multiple times, and we'll just look at what happens between different time periods. And we're going to pick a location that is towards the lower end of Reach 5A, right here. So what this is showing us on the y-axis here is the elevation of the bed, and this is the distance across the channel. And we're looking at the comparison of two surveys done between July 2001 to February 2002. If we see an area that is brown, that represents an accumulation of sediment over that time period. If we see a place that is blue, that indicates that sediments were eroded in that time interval. So I'll advance now to different time periods, each consecutive cross-sectional survey. So now here we see one that is just a little bit more than a year. A short time interval, just a couple of months. And we see that the blue area represents that in this time period, there was erosion of sediment that had accumulated previously. Now, if we look from April 2002 to June of 2003, so a little bit more than a year, we see just small changes across the river, different places, little bits of erosion, little bits of deposition. Now we go to the next time interval, to March 2005, and you see that there had been an accumulation of sediment in two parts of the river. But then by June of 2005, that had eroded. So sediments come and sediments go. I think to a large extent that's influenced by the source of solids that are coming from bank erosion. You get a big event, solids deposited in the river, they work their way down, but then they get remobilized. So the banks, I mentioned those, we looked at sediment PCB concentrations. Well, here's a comparison of PCB concentrations in the bank soils. And you can see that to a large extent they're comparable to what we see in the sediments of the river. So that when those soils erode from the banks and fall in the river, that represents an important source of PCBs and how they're moving around. We see that the sediment and bank soil PCB concentrations drop off substantially below Woods Pond. It reaches 7, 8, and 9 here. So if we look at a distribution of where are PCBs coming from, PCBs that come into the water, we see that a small fraction, in this case 7%, are coming in from the east and west branches, and then almost a 50-50 split between what's coming from bank soil versus sediments that are eroding. And I talk about the bank soil, where does that go? Well, about a third of it deposits somewhere else in the channel. About 40% is transported during those high flow events out onto the floodplain. And then about 25% of it flows over Woods Pond Dam and moves downstream. We wonder, Woods Pond, a quiescent place like that, how much accumulation of PCBs happens there? Is it an effective trap for PCBs? And we evaluated the mass of PCBs coming into Woods Pond and the mass leaving, and we see that the difference, there's only about 10% of what comes in that is retained in the pond. Solids retention is a little bit higher because solids settle and they stay there, but PCBs settle, but then they can diffuse back into the water as a dissolved source to the water. So the trapping efficiency of PCBs is fairly low in Woods Pond. About 90% of what comes in is transported out over Woods Pond Dam. So in summary, the PCB transport and distribution is based on an extensive data set. We have thousands of measurements to tell us where the PCBs are and where they're moving. They're spread out in the river, they're on the floodplain, there are no hotspots in the river, but they're widely distributed and highly variable. When PCBs in the channel get buried, they don't necessarily get buried permanently. They can be re-eroded. The riverbanks represent an important source. The floodwaters carry PCBs out onto the floodplain. And the recovery rate of the system overall is slow. We see that from measurements, even after the the East Branch was remediated, and we see it in young of the year fish that don't show much of a change over the last 8 years or so. So we have a lot of information. You'll hear more from our speakers on the modeling and what's happening for human health and ecological risk. And thank you.
Just a reminder, the PowerPoints will go up on the website tomorrow. There's just too many to reproduce for everyone, but they're fully accessible there. Ed, one question for now, and if folks have other questions, 2 questions for now. Folks have other questions, please, write them down, and Ed will be coming back later. Are consulting firms and EPA itself allowed to tell us how much confidence they have in GE's own studies, e.g. the data presented in a slide by Ed Garland?
How much data could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Are consulting firms and EPA itself allowed to tell us how much confidence they have in GE's own studies, e.g. the data presented in a slide by Ed Garland?
We do understand the confidence that we should have in the data. There are different types of data. We can have more confidence in some types of data, less in others. But that would be the case in any location, in any study. The analytical work like PCBs, there's more variability in or uncertainty in those measurements. In terms of the analyses, well, that's under review. But in terms of the data, yeah, we think that the data certainly are adequate to make the evaluations that are being made right now.
Okay. How did PCBs get into the bank to begin with?
That is a very good question. There are a lot of theories of how it may have gotten in there. In some cases, it could be that the river has moved so that what had been banks, what had been channel before, sediments accumulated there and the river is sort of moving. There could be channels from biota or tunnels from biota that get it in there. It could be through deposition that has occurred there. So a lot of potential explanations, but no truly definitive, we know for sure this is how it got there. We know that it's there, is what we know.
Okay, thank you. If sediment deposition occurs continually, how is it PCBs are found in near 10 feet of riverbed?
If
sediment deposition occurs continually, how is it that PCBs are found in near 10 feet of riverbed?
Sediments obviously have accumulated in those places, but sediments in the system are reworked substantially. The important thing to note is it is not occurring continuously. It is occurring episodically, followed by reworking where it's remobilized and transported to different places.
How would Woods Pond serve as a more effective PCB trap if it is dredged? How much more so?
That's a common impression that people have, or misconception, that if you dredged the pond, it would collect sediment more efficiently. If you think about it, you have a certain volume of water there, and water is flowing through. If you make it deeper, it will take longer for the water to flow through it. But it also will take longer for particles that are settling to hit the bottom. So from simple analyses when treatment plants are designed, we see that that's not the controlling parameter. The depth of the pond or the depth of a sedimentation tank is not what controls the trapping. So it's those type of, just deepening the pond will not have a substantial effect on the trapping of solids. And even solids, if more were trapped, more PCBs would be released back into the water. So any increase in trapping of solids would not be accompanied by a corresponding increase in trapping of PCBs.
Okay. The presence of hotspots is a matter of scale. You may not have hotspots comparing a desktop size. However, there are areas of higher concentration, as shown in your figure on the PSA.
Oh, there clearly are locations where there are high concentrations, but a place, I think the data set that I talked about, that small scale, that tells us that a foot away, the concentration could be a factor of 50 to 100 lower. So when we think of hotspots, we think of places where you could go and remove sediment. Well, you can't target areas when the variability is as great as it is here to say, I'll go to this area, remove this hotspot, and that will get rid of a lot of PCBs. What you're going to find is it'll give you something probably like the average in that reach.
Okay. We heard last night that PCBs adsorb onto sediment. Why then is Woods Pond impoundment not capturing more PCBs?
Well, I think I've addressed that a little bit. The solids trapping efficiency is maybe on the scale of about 20%, 25%. It depends on the flow conditions. They carry PCBs to the sediment, but some of the PCBs that are carried to the sediment come back to the water column through a diffusive release from the sediment. And the pond itself is not accumulating solids at a high rate. And in part, that's because solids are transported out onto the floodplain and are deposited out there. The sedimentation rate in Woods Pond is 0.4 to 0.6 centimeters per year on average. So a very small amount of sediment accumulation, if you think about it.
And same question, if Woods Pond were made deeper, would it slow down outflow of PCB to be collected later? To be collected later.
And I think we've answered that one.
Similar, you said the Woods Pond does not efficiently trap PCBs. Would that change if Woods Pond were dredged and capable of holding more sediment? Where are the PCBs from Woods Pond going? The slide presentation would indicate over 1/2 are going onto the floodplain. Are the rest moving downstream?
PCBs are moving downstream, and when they move downstream, then they accumulate in places that, like the impoundments behind the dams downstream, and they are, some are trapped, some are transported farther down, and they work their way down over Rising Pond, and less and less, and there's more dilution, more inflow of solids and water coming in. So the concentrations are declining as you go downstream. But
And one last question, I believe, for now. Does any amount of PCB sediment load and H2O column load after it exits Woods Pond continue downriver into Connecticut, or does it all stop at the Massachusetts border?
I think we know the answer to that one. It's moving down, but as I just mentioned, it's being diluted. Some PCBs are being trapped along the way, and they're also being diluted by other freshwater inflows.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
There's a question for me, which is what is Certa Strategies and their role in this process? Certa Strategies was tasked by the EPA last fall to conduct a series of interviews amongst stakeholders in the community. Those interviews indicated that there was, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of information that's existing around the Resta River, that the community was asking for a way to sort of focus the information, help help you to understand it better. And so we suggested out of those interviews these series of workshops with this type of detailed focus and working with the EPA came up with this structure, and Certus was then now assisting the EPA in producing these events as well as producing the charrette, all with an aim in mind of helping to educate the community more about the research, the analysis that the EPA has been putting into this effort for many years, and then for us to be able to get your feedback, your concerns, your interests, issues out in a more, in a different way, let's say, than a traditional comment period of just written notice and comment that most agencies are accustomed to. So it's another way of drawing information and concerns out from you, and all that will go to hopefully inform the EPA's decision at the end of the day, where your words, your influence helps to make a difference in that regards. And Certus is assisting the EPA along those lines. The questions are not on the website yet, and they will be up as soon as we can get to it. Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Donna Voorhees. Dr. Voorhees received her master's and doctorate from the Harvard School of Public Health. She specializes in multi-pathway exposure assessment and human health risk assessment of chemicals indoor and outdoor environments. I invite you, I refer the workbook has the full bios. I don't want to take your time. I do want you to hear from Donna tonight. Dr. Voorhees.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Good evening, everybody. Glad to see you here. So you've been hearing all about the natural history of the river from last night. Ed just traced a PCB molecule down the river. Because I worked on the human health risk assessment, I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of people, and specifically you, people who care about the river and are using the river. And so our work really started with the question of, how are people enjoying the river now? And the river and also the associated floodplains. We wanted to have a good understanding of that because our goal with the human health risk assessment was to answer the question, are the PCBs in the river or the floodplain possibly affecting people's health, harming people's health? So this was our goal in the human health risk assessment, to answer this pretty broad question. Why? Well, because you may have heard that there's some concern that PCBs could harm people's health. And this slide provides, I would say, the barest summary of some of the types of health effects that have been linked with PCBs. A lot of the work is done in animal studies. There are some more recent studies in humans, looking at people exposed at sort of what I'll call environmental levels versus occupational levels, immune system effects, some concern for neurodevelopmental effects, and reproductive effects, and so on. For cancer, there are studies in animals that show that PCBs cause cancer in some animal models. There continue to be studies published in the scientific literature looking at humans and possible cancer effects. And at this point, EPA has classified PCBs as a probable human carcinogen, as has the an international agency, IARC. So in the assessment, we assume that PCBs can have non-cancer effects in humans, and they can also have cancer effects in humans, and we quantified both. Now, I posed that very broad question, are PCBs in the river and the floodplain affecting people's health? But we thought about how people use the river, and here are some of the more specific questions we tried to answer, like, can you go play by the river? Can you go fishing? Can you eat the fish? Two separate questions. I think you all know eating the fish is not advised at this point, but can you just go and fish and do catch and release? Can you hunt? And so on. And so to make sure we evaluated those as well as we could and as realistically as we could, we did not do what often happens in human health risk assessments. We did not open up EPA's guidance documents and pick out default values for various kinds of exposure variables. Instead, we did a lot of research locally. We used Massachusetts DPH's exposure study that they did back in 1997, where they asked people about how they use the river, did they go hunting, how long they lived there. We also interviewed local officials, local planning officials, regional planning agencies, read the land use plans that were in place. I worked a lot on the agricultural evaluation. We interviewed farmers, spent some time at USDA's office looking at what farmers are doing and what they hope to do in the future. So the analysis we did is grounded in this research on how people are really using the river and really using the adjacent floodplain. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I know. If I could have a voice transplant, I would. I'm sorry. Okay. So that's what people are doing, but we also had to think about now where exactly are they doing these various activities. This is the Decker canoe launch. So as you know, people are obviously launching canoes at the Decker canoe launch. There's also walking trails. Oh, excuse me, let me just back up one. This is one of 90 different exposure areas that we evaluated. And actually we evaluated more than 90 because in some of those we evaluated some sub-areas where people were spending a lot of their time. Also evaluated 8 different sediment areas that were divided up approximately by level of PCB contamination. So there's the canoe launch, and just here locally there are also trails through here, people bird watching, people just going for a walk. And so we needed to pair that information about where people were spending their time with our data on PCB concentrations. And so what you see plotted here, the little squares are sediment samples, and the little circles are soil samples, and the colors tell you approximately the PCB concentration in those areas. And our goal here was to make sure we had samples that told us what are the PCB concentrations where people are spending their time, so that we could do a good job quantifying their exposure to those PCBs. And so we did this times 90 plus some sub areas. And we did it for this terrible phrase exposure scenario, but basically an exposure scenario is a conceptualization about how people are using the river and the floodplain. So we evaluated somebody who lives nearby, we evaluated farmers, we evaluated the farm family, people who buy products from the farms, we looked at people who dig in the ground, utility workers, groundskeepers, and a whole range of recreational activities that people reported engaging in. And that was for actually, let me back up. That's for direct contact with soil and sediment, right? Farmers actually digging in the dirt and getting exposed, or if somebody's, wading down by the river, they might actually be touching the sediment. We also evaluated people who are eating the fish and eating the waterfowl. Species vary whether you're in Massachusetts or Connecticut, but we evaluated the species and had concentration data for the species that people favor or like to catch. And for agricultural products and home gardens, we start with the floodplain soil, right? That's where these would be. And we looked at a range of farming activities. We looked at commercial farms producing dairy, beef, poultry, and also produce, vegetables, fruit. And we also looked at backyard farms. So this would be somebody deciding they want to keep a few chickens in the backyard, or they have their one dairy cow that they rely on. So we looked at both kind of farms. And you know what? I'm going to skip to the end for one question, because I know there are a lot of commercial dairy farms in the area, and you may enjoy those dairy farms and the milk from them. And I'll just tell you that we didn't identify any concerns with the current commercial dairy farms, okay? But we did look at this wider range of other farms that could exist sometime in the future. We looked at home gardens, and also, as I said, the commercial farms that produce commercially produced vegetables and fruit. And there was some concern about people going out and collecting fiddlehead ferns and other kinds of wild plants for the purpose of consumption, people hunting. So we also looked at these individuals. And so what did we find? So coming back to this question of, are the PCBs in the river potentially harming people's health? Okay, I'm going to show you a subset of the results. If I showed you all of them, we wouldn't go home till midnight, so forgive me, but I'll be around and happy to answer any questions you have. But this slide is looking at exposure to soil, and along the bottom axis is all of the See if this will work. Can you see that when I do that? These are all those scenarios I told you about, residential, recreation. We're told people do ATV dirt biking, the marathon canoeists. And then along this axis is cancer risk. And here is what EPA refers to as the EPA risk range. Now, the bottom end of that range, the scientific lingo, 1 to the minus 6, all that means is one chance in a million, okay? And in this context, it means 1 chance in a million of getting cancer. Not 1 chance in a million of dying, 1 chance in a million of getting cancer. That's the bottom end of the EPA risk range.
PCBs.
Sorry?
It may not be from the PCBs, it may be just those are people who happen to be recreating and get cancer.
Right, well, right now I'm just defining what these numbers mean. That's all I want to say. Okay, and then the top part of the risk range is 1 to the minus 4. And again, just in regular words, that's 1 chance in 10,000. Okay, and so what we see here is if the cancer risk is less than 1 in a million, EPA would generally regard that as not something that we worry about, relatively low risk. Now that's a value judgment, not my judgment, but just conveying that to you. And then if you get above 1 to the minus 4 or 1 in 10,000 cancer risk, it starts to get to a point where EPA would regard that as something that perhaps would want to take some kind of action. And in between is discretionary, and they may or may not. So what you see here is for cancer risk, most of these things that people are doing in the floodplain where they're exposed to soil are below this upper end of the EPA risk range, okay? Below those levels that are particularly high. Now, I'm going to show you the exact same thing for non-cancer effects. Okay, so along the bottom, these are the same scenarios, but now this y-axis or the vertical axis is something called a hazard index. And all that is we looked at how people use the floodplain, we quantified how much exposure we thought they had, and we compared it to an exposure that is thought to be without any risk to human health. Literally divided what people are exposed to, divided by what we think is safe. And if the number's more than 1, maybe there's a potential for adverse effect. If the number's less than 1, we feel pretty confident that there's no harm to human health. And so here the picture is a little bit different than the one I showed you for cancer. Okay, here, for some of the scenarios, we see values above 1. So slightly different. And what this means, what these bars mean, remember earlier I said we looked at 90 exposure areas? So that bar is all of those exposure areas. So for example, here's general recreation right here. That means for a whole lot of the exposure areas, you're below 1, and it's fine. But for some of them, you're actually somewhat above 1. Okay, so again, still talking about direct contact with soil and sediment. The PCBs in soil, as I said, cancer risks are either within EPA's risk range or below it for the most part. The non-cancer hazard indices, some are above, some are below. It depends on where you are within the floodplain. PCBs in sediment, there was a question about sediment earlier. And sediment also, cancer risks were either within the EPA risk range or below. And the non-cancer hazard indices were greater than 1 at 4 of the 8 sediment areas. And you can imagine those are some of the sediment areas you saw where there are higher concentrations in the sediment. And the reason why it's hard to say exactly what sediment concentration is bad is because it depends on how much time you're spending exposed to it, right? So if you're out there 1 day a week, couple of months a year, you're not getting much exposure. If you're going down there and rubbing sediment all over yourself, 5 days a week, you're obviously going to get a very different exposure. So that's why it's a hard question to answer. But I'd be happy to stay after and talk in detail about that and what was assumed in the risk assessment if it would be helpful. Okay, risk from fish and waterfowl consumption. I could show you the same plot, but I think we all know there are fish consumption advisories and waterfowl advisory for a reason. Basically, all of the risk estimates confirmed that indeed we need those advisories. The cancer risk estimates and the non-cancer hazard indices are well above EPA benchmarks. And they're higher further upstream, okay, up Woods Pond and upstream of Woods Pond. than they are lower, further downstream. For agricultural products, for those of you with home gardens, at PCB concentrations of about 2 parts per million, and even up to 10 parts per million or so, a home garden is okay. Same was true for the wild edible plants. We actually went out and collected fiddlehead ferns and analyzed them, and analyzed some home garden produce. And as I said earlier, the currently operating dairy farms were fine. Now, the big caveat here is if a new kind of commercial operation was begun here, or if people started backyard farming, they are not necessarily okay above this a concentration in soil of about 2 parts per million. So it really depends. For the farming scenarios, it really depends on exactly what you're doing and how intensive the soil exposure is. Okay, what does this all mean for you? Just trying to distill it down, some activities are fine. So for example, if you love canoeing, by all means go canoeing. Okay, we didn't quantify any significant risk with canoeing anywhere. Some activities are okay in some places, but not necessarily others. Farming is an example of one of those. Some activities aren't okay anywhere at all in Massachusetts. That's fish consumption. An important caveat is Connecticut, you can eat the fish to some extent in Connecticut, and if you're interested in doing that, just make sure you check out Connecticut's advisories. But there is some fish consumption possible there. And what would happen with remediation? Well, first of all, I don't know if remediation is going to happen, and if it does happen, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. So I really can't predict it. All I can say is if with some remediation, presumably the lower the PCB concentrations in the soil, the more those exposure areas we evaluated would be opened up to full use, all of the uses that we considered in the risk assessment. If the river was remediated such that PCB concentrations in fish went down, you'd be able to eat more fish, and you'd be able to eat the fish sooner than if there was no remediation. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to show you one plot from the corrective measure study, a modified plot from the corrective measure study for Woods Pond. And on this plot, now here we are on this vertical axis. This is the concentration of PCBs in edible fish tissue. Okay, this is the part of the fish that people would eat. And now on this horizontal axis is years. These are other people, and the next speaker is going to talk about modeling. I didn't do the modeling. I'm just looking at the results of the modeling. But these are the number of years out, and the model went out 52 years or so. All right, so here we are in year 0, and they're modeling the change in PCB concentration over time. Now this blue line, the top line, that's the no action or monitored natural recovery plot and prediction. And as you can see, I just kind of tell you how many meals per year an adult could eat at different time intervals. So 10 years out, you're still eating less than a meal a year. You can't really eat much fish. So it goes without saying that with no action, obviously, you can't, even at 50 years, you're not going to be eating any of the fish. But with some of these alternatives, looking at 20 years out, you're looking at 6 to 10 meals per year, and you get further out, 15 to 23 meals per year. Now, you may have two questions. Why am I giving you these ranges, 15 to 23? What's that all about? And just to clarify, the range is because we're considering a couple of factors like over how many years do you eat these fish? Okay, so if you want to eat fish for the next 20 years, the number's a little smaller. And also, when you cook fish, some of the PCBs can be lost from the tissue. So this range is accounting for that variability that goes on when you cook the fish. But this, in general, these are the ranges that we're looking at. The meal size, I'm assuming, is a half-pound meal. And just to put it into perspective, in the risk assessment, we looked at the best studies on how much fish people are eating. By best, I mean those that best reflect what people would be doing in the Housatonic but for the contamination. And the average person in the forward risk assessment would be eating about 13 to 14 meals per year. So just to put that into perspective. And also just to let you know, this is only Woods Pond, so the image changes slightly if you look at different reaches of the river. Okay, and I just want to close with the fact that all of this, the human health risk assessment was peer-reviewed. One of the major comments of the peer reviewers is that we should do quantitative uncertainty analysis. We did that. I did not spend a lot of time showing you that tonight because it would have just made the presentation even longer, but suffice it to say that it didn't change the overarching conclusions, frankly reinforced the findings from the original risk assessment. And with that, I'll leave it to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Donna, the first set of questions. What kinds of cancer or what specific organs or systems are most often affected or caused by PCBs? What are the exposure levels, risk ratios?
Okay. So in animals, the basis for our quantification of PCB cancer risk is based on animals, and it's liver cancer is the dominant one. In humans, there are studies that are positive studies and negative studies. Historically, there's been concern about breast cancer. There have been a lot of negative studies recently. Liver cancer in some of the occupational cohorts. More recently, there's discussion of a possible link with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Again, you see maybe more positive than negative studies. I haven't counted. But it's an active area of research. So if I cannot stand here tonight and tell you this is the kind of cancer that PCBs cause in humans because we really don't know at this point. It's, like I said, it's an active area of research. The second part of the question, could you repeat it? Because I'm not sure I...
What are the exposure levels / risk ratios?
Okay, so I'm going to assume that the question means how much do you have to be exposed to before you see an effect of cancer? I hope that's the question, and if not, please write me another question and clarify it. Again, that's a really difficult question to answer. I don't think anybody can answer it with certainty. Okay, I'll be honest with you about that. What we did do is we used the best quantitative information we have to date for defining what level of exposure leads to various levels of cancer risk, and that's what you see in the risk assessment. And I think that's the best answer I have for that one.
Is there anything people can do to clean their bodies of PCBs, or ways to remove from human tissue?
As of this time, no. I don't know of any. I've had people at public meetings tell me about various methods that they've heard about, but I am not aware of anything that will really remove PCBs from your body. The only there's the unfortunate removal. I mean, you do lose some of your PCBs via breast milk, and that's not to dissuade anybody from breastfeeding their children, because the jury basically still tilts in favor of breastfeeding regardless. But in general, no, there's no way to remove PCBs. It's not like metals where some people, there are some methods for people who've been perhaps highly exposed to lead.
How do people avoid exposure if they do not fish and release, eat the fish, or live nearby the river? Is PCB exposure avoidable?
Okay.
How do people avoid exposure if they do not fish in the river,
okay,
eat the fish, or live nearby the river? Is PCB exposure avoidable?
PCB exposure is not completely avoidable for anybody on the planet Earth at this point. I mean, PCBs have been distributed widely through the environment. It really comes down to a question of how much exposure you get. So they're not completely avoidable, is the answer to the question. It's just that the concentrations in the floodplain and in the river are relatively high compared to a lot of other places on the planet.
How do you show that PCBs in the river threaten human health of those living along the river? How do you show that PCBs in the river threaten human health of those living along the river?
How do you show it? Well, you study it to the best of your ability. It's a very hard thing to study. It's very hard to study human exposure to contaminants in the environment for a whole bunch of reasons. As you all know, we don't do We don't do studies on humans. It's unethical. And so we always are faced with this problem with the human studies of, how much exactly were they exposed to, and trying to link that back to an effect. So it's very hard to say. In the risk assessment, basically the assumption is that PCBs can harm human health. We've used the estimates of cancer potency and non-cancer toxicity that are the most generally accepted estimates, and we've used that to predict what harm might come to people.
Are they airborne?
Yeah, all PCBs have some amount of volatility. Now, the particular fraction that is in this floodplain is one of the least volatile mixtures, meaning it's one of the mixtures of PCBs that's least likely to get into the air, but some amount does. And actually, in 1995 and in 1999, air sampling was conducted in some of the areas where the highest PCB concentrations have been measured in soil. And that was done intentionally with the goal of determining, could PCBs be in air at concentrations of concern for human health? Let's go measure it where the concentrations are highest in soil, and let's go measure it during the warmer months of the year when PCBs are more likely to evaporate. So that was done in 1995 and 1999. And in 1995, the concentrations were all below the laboratory detection limits. And in 1999, some of those samples were collected up closer to the GE facility, some during excavation. And there were some detected concentrations of PCBs at that time, but they were actually far below levels of concern for human health.
Okay. The next, I think you just answered, but has an EPA tested the air around the river and found no contamination?
No. I mean, in the one round of sampling, they found no contamination back in 1995. And then in the more recent round, again, there was excavation, other things going on. They did detect some PCBs, but at low concentrations.
Didn't the Mass Department of Public Health find no elevated blood levels among Allendale school population?
I have not looked at that study in any detail. I can get back and answer the question after this meeting. I will just say that it's a very different scenario. You're talking about a school environment, and it's just different from what's happening near the river. So I'm not sure I would compare the two.
And then also the Lakewood population. So didn't the Mass Department of Public Health find no elevated blood levels among the Lakewood population?
The Lakewood?
Yeah.
I don't have an opinion about that. I'd have to read the study.
In her book and documentary film, Living Downstream, Dr. Sonda Steingraber states that PCBs have been found on the tops of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. If PCBs attached to dry sediments can move to those remote regions, shouldn't we be concerned that PCBs from the Housatonic River floodplain, which are in much higher concentrations, present a danger of inhalation to people who live in communities near the river?
Right. So there's a couple things. Yes, PCBs are widely distributed in the planet. They've gone farther than the White Mountains. I mean, PCBs were used around the world, not in all regions, but many regions of the world, and they've been found in Arctic environments all over the place. Should people be concerned around the river? Again, the concentrations near the river measured during warm months of the year, where you would expect, the most to be there because the soil concentrations are high, the concentrations were low. So I understand that it can be a source of confusion. Yes, the PCBs are getting into air. Yes, they're moving around the planet. But even near the river, the concentrations are very low.
I'm going to ask two more questions. I have a lot. You've asked a lot of questions to Donna this evening. We'll get to as many as we can afterwards with the full panel, but we have two other speakers who we have to get to as well. So your questions will get answered this evening or on the website, so bear with us. Donna, what studies with actual human statistical data have shown that PCBs actually cause cancer in humans? We know that there are animal studies, but not many studies that link cancer in humans to PCB exposure.
So the word cause was used, and let me just tell you, I'm not, that's a very high bar to say a study shows that PCBs cause anything. Usually in our studies of humans, we call them epidemiological studies. You maybe see an association, but it's really tough to say it actually caused it. So I would say, I wouldn't say that it's been shown that PCBs cause certain kinds of cancer. What I will say is you look at the literature on humans and you will see some studies that find a positive association between PCBs and some forms of cancer. You will also find some studies that do not find an association between PCBs and cancer. And therein lies room for lots of debate among scientists, which I'm sure is annoying to those of you who are trying to make up your minds about this and think about it. But that is the state of the science. And it's the nature of things. It's not just PCBs, it's a lot of chemicals out there. Again, we don't experiment on people, thankfully. And so for that reason, it's very difficult to link an exposure that happens at relatively low levels over time with an effect in people who are themselves moving around. And so it's just a real challenge with studies in human populations.
Last question for now. What is the actual pathway where PCBs affect human tissue? And what is the pathology that shows cause and effect with statistical confidence?
Yeah, okay. So let me just, by way of disclaimer, I'm not a pathologist, and I'm not going to pretend to be one. I'm a risk assessor, a biology major, and I've read a lot of literature on PCBs, but I'm definitely not a pathologist. There are a number of different mechanisms by which PCBs may cause harm to people. I'm going to again say this is an active area of research. I mean, there are some PCBs that they're believed to act like dioxin, okay, but that's just a small subset of the PCBs. And other PCBs maybe have effects on dopamine, and some may influence serum lipids in blood. I mean, there's just all kinds of hypothesized mechanisms out there for PCBs. And in fact, there was a nice review back in 2008, and if anybody's interested, I can direct you to the paper where they tried to review all of the different mechanisms that are subjects of ongoing research. But I have to unfortunately give you the unsatisfying answer that most of it is the subject of ongoing research.
Donna, thank you.
Thank you.
Gary Lawrence has his master's in resource management from Simon Fraser University and an undergraduate degree from the University of Victoria. Gary is an senior environmental scientist, risk assessment expert with Golder Associates, Inc. in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's been working on the Resta River for many years. Gary's a senior scientist, as I mentioned. He specializes in aquatic and terrestrial ecological risk assessment, ecotoxicology, risk modeling of environmental systems, including bioaccumulation modeling. Gary Lawrence.
Thanks very much. It's good to be back in the Berkshires, and I want to say at the outset that I feel really privileged to have worked on this project. It's been over a decade now, and it's certainly been among the most interesting, if not the most interesting project. It's fascinating in terms of the volume of information that's available. You've seen the thousands of samples that are available, but it's not just the amount, it's the type and the quality of the scrutiny that's gone into the studies that's really compelling. Using cutting-edge techniques, the peer review process of independent analysis, it's been a real privilege. And I know for a lot of you, this is not just a project. This is your home turf. It's your backyard and your environment. So forgive me if I sound too science-y, and I'll try to answer your questions at the end. Because of the volume of information that we have, it's tough to break it down. The binders for the ecological risk assessment will probably come up to about here if you stack them. So I tried to think of a basic concept that would unite some of the things that we're going to think about tonight. And one concept that came to mind was something that was thought about 500 years ago by a fellow named Paracelsus, who was a Renaissance man, but he was anointed the father of toxicology. One of the things that he said, or I'm paraphrasing here, he said, "The dose makes the poison." And I think that relates to a lot of things that have already come up in some of your questions. This is not an issue about whether PCBs are toxic or not toxic. And especially for ecological receptors, we have tons of studies showing that they can be toxic, but whether they are and to what degree depends on the dose or the concentration. It's not a yes or no decision, it's a scale. With increasing exposure comes increasing risk. So you may ask yourself, well, do PCBs really have a meaningful influence on animals, period? The simple answer is yes, they can, but the dose makes the poison. And so what have the studies done over the last few decades told us? Well, there's a couple take-home messages. One is that some PCBs act through a mechanism of toxicity that's similar to dioxin. We've heard of this already for human health. The same applies for some ecological receptors. Not all. Not invertebrates, but for mammals, yes. There are also other ways that PCBs have been shown to cause effects. And we're more conclusive with ecological receptors relative to humans because we have this luxury, if you can call it that, of being able to test them directly. It's not done as commonly now as it was in the 70s and 80s, but it's still done as needed. And these other experiments have shown that other mechanisms of action have caused growth, development, and reproductive effects. There's a couple photos there. The shot of the fish shows an external swim bladder, which is an abnormality that was documented in some of the site-specific studies that Don Tillett and his group did as part of this project. Another question you may ask yourself, looking at the system, it appears green and lush and pretty in many ways. And so you may say, well, what about the PCBs? Is there a reason that I should be concerned? And I would caution you against making a very superficial analysis based on what you can see from a distance. There are some effects that are hidden simply because you can't see what's not there. And we know that there are organisms that should be present in the system at much greater abundances or greater diversity than we currently see. There are also potential issues about additive effects of different stresses. As an example, we don't have a fishing pressure on the fish populations right now because it's not acceptable to consume fish from the river. Presumably lower stress on fish populations than you'd expect under a typical condition. So we don't know fully what the effect of PCBs is on exerting low-level stresses for some of our receptors. So really it boils down to, is the system reaching its full ecological potential? And the answer is no. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into which things are as expected and which are not. So another question you may have, are different animals affected in the same way? And the answer to that is no. We already have pretty good understanding of some animals that we know are particularly sensitive to dioxin-like toxicity. And I've got some examples there under on the top row. Mink have been shown to be particularly sensitive, amphibians as well, and I've got an example of a benthic invertebrate. That's a crustacean, Hyalella is the genus name, but there's also some that are not sensitive. Tree swallows have been documented to be not sensitive to PCBs in a number of field studies. Similarly, fish in this particular context and at this site were shown to be borderline in terms of their influence on fish. And even within groups of receptors, you see some variation. So on the right-hand side, I've got two types of invertebrates. Although the Hyalella were particularly sensitive, other animals, in this case it's a freshwater annelid or a worm, it is not particularly sensitive. And this is normal for sensitivity to chemicals to vary among different groups. Different animals handle toxicants differently. They have different systems to cope with them. So in our ecological risk assessment, we weren't able, nor was it necessary, to evaluate every organism in the entire watershed. We'd never finish. Instead, we chose representative species that we thought covered the spectrum of sensitivity, most of the habitat types, and that were applicable to the conditions that we see in the watershed. The reason for doing that is not just a matter of efficiency, but we actually have really good baseline knowledge for some of these organisms. We've got a really strong database for mink toxicity, just as one example. The approach that we used in the eco-risk assessment, although it was very detailed, it was fairly consistent across our receptor types. So we applied the same 3 major lines of evidence for every type of receptor that we evaluated. And I'll briefly run over the 3 here, and then I'll have a slide on each one to follow it up. One way you can evaluate is by measuring chemical concentrations in the environment and comparing those concentrations to a database of effects levels that you determine from the literature. The second way is to take site-specific samples, put animals in them in a controlled environment, and see whether or not bad things happen. The third way is to again go out to the real environment and evaluate the communities in their natural condition and accepting the variability that goes with that kind of study. So I'm going to have a quick discussion on each of those 3. The chemistry line of evidence, what we're doing here is we're trying to get the most information we can derive out of the decades of research that's gone into PCB toxicity. And I'm talking about everything from toxicity tests done in a laboratory to field studies of mammals. Whichever study we use, we're looking for what we call a concentration response relationship. Some way of showing how, as the PCB concentration or dose increases, does the incidence of effects go up appreciably, and by how much? So this particular example is for mink. It's looking at the reproduction of mink kits, and you can see that as you increase the PCB dose from around 0.1 up to 1, your percent adverse effect increases, and it increases substantially. So that's the general approach. The second line of evidence is more site-specific, because now we're not relying on literature. I think that Donna expressed it well by communicating that this was not a desktop exercise. We weren't picking parameters out of a textbook. We did a lot of work that's based on real sampling within the river system. And the toxicity testing is one such example of that. A number of receptors, we took them into a controlled environment in a laboratory, or conducted in a controlled condition in the field, an enclosure, for example, and we exposed animals and tracked how much PCB affected those animals for endpoints like whether they lived or died, whether they grew, and whether they reproduced, and whether they exhibited malformations that would be threatening to the health of that animal. And a lot of those studies were really cutting edge, and they included things like what I have referred to here as a crossover study, which is a bit of both. It's a bit of a field condition combined with a bit of a lab condition, and is trying to take the best out of both worlds. Those toxicity studies were done by some of the preeminent specialists in wildlife ecotoxicology. A lot of these were university professors that specialized in these areas. There was tests done by EPA contractors, but there was also studies done by GE contractors. An example is the amphibian work. Wood frog studies were done by both. I don't have time to list them all out, and it's not a complete list anyway, so I'll just move on to the third line of evidence, which is the field studies. This is where you go out and you look at populations and communities, and you look for signs that in the natural world there's measurable evidence of adverse effects of an individual substance. Now, these are tricky studies to do, because how do you assess the effect of one thing like PCBs in the midst of all kinds of other natural sources of variation? So it's both a positive because it's very realistic, it's the real world, but it's also challenging because you have to accept the variability that goes along with it. And really, when you put these 3 lines of evidence together, what you're doing is fundamentally you're asking the same question: are PCBs causing an effect at a given level of exposure? But you're looking at it in a different way, in a different perspective. If you think of looking sideways and topways and crossways, you're looking at the same thing just with a different perspective. And each of those perspectives has advantages and disadvantages. So what did those field studies show? Well, first of all, it was clear that there was a range of sensitivity of the organisms that we tested. And that's across groups of organisms. So fish were different in their sensitivity to mammals, and the mammals were different than birds. And we also saw differences within groups of animals, such as the invertebrates that I mentioned before. And this is expected. Nature is variable. The uncertainty is not a dirty word, nor is variability. So some of these studies actually showed quite a strong toxic response. I'm going to give you some examples in the upcoming slides, so I won't belabor that point now. But there was also some that showed either a lack of response or an equivocal response. And I'll mention some of those as well. Just some examples of ones that were tolerant, because I don't have slides on these in detail. Tree swallows are a group of birds that have been studied at a number of sites. And at this particular site, there's what I would characterize as being a weak statistical relationship for some parameters and not for others. And on the whole, there was not a strong or compelling relationship between PCBs and tree swallow endpoints. Another example is the kingfisher study that GE did, which also did not show a strong response. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my presentation is I'm just going to step through some examples of different receptor groups, explain what the overall risk conclusion was, and then just a really punchy description of why we made that determination. Benthic invertebrates, we did a wide battery of toxicity tests, both in the laboratory and in the field. And we also did a benthic community study where we measured enumerated animals in sediments grabbed directly from the river. What we found was that there was toxicity to most species within the range of concentrations that we observe in the river. We also found that the benthic community studies showed responses within the concentration range in the river. And the two, they're more or less compatible with one another. Both of those site-specific studies showed a lesser response than you would get if you just did a pull it off the shelf, compare your chemistry concentrations to a sediment screening value. But they still showed significant responses, and on that basis they were assigned high risk. There was a question before about what level of PCB is of concern. Well, this is actually one of the receptors where it's easiest to answer that question, so I'll just use it as an example. EPA derived a threshold in sediment protective of benthic invertebrates, and that value was 3. So if you relate that back to Ed's presentation where you had concentration ranges, often the averages were around, I think it was around 15 is the average for each 5A. Obviously 15 is greater than 3 and justifies the high risk determination there. All of the concentrations across the primary study area from the confluence to Woods Pond on a reach by reach basis would exceed that 3 part per million value. Amphibians are another broad exposure group. There was toxicity testing done with wood frog and leopard frog. Some was done by Ford Environmental Labs, some was done by GE through their consultants, Housatonic. And we observed significant toxicity at a particular life stage of wood frog. There's a critical life stage when wood frogs transform from their larval stage to full-on frog stage, and there's research showing that that's a particularly sensitive time where frogs are vulnerable to developmental abnormalities. And we observed a lot of malformations in frogs when they were exposed at that critical life stage. The timing and magnitude of that exposure was important, and we found that if you looked at that life stage, you could establish a relationship between PCB concentration and the number and type of malformations. Just as an example, there's a photo there of larvae that have kinked tails, but there's many other endpoints I don't have time to go to in detail. The bottom one is an edema, which is a swelling of tissues. The community assessment backed up the results of our amphibian toxicity evaluation because it showed that there was a reduced number of species of amphibians in vernal pools that had the highest PCB concentrations, and also there were fewer salamanders, which are a sensitive subgroup of amphibians, in contaminated vernal pools as well. So just to mix it up, let's shift to something that wasn't quite so sensitive. Overall, we have a low to moderate risk determination for fish. I should be clear that there were abnormalities observed in some of the site-specific tests that we did, and some of those abnormalities are linked to the dioxin-like mechanism of action that we've talked about. One example is the external swim bladder that you saw a picture of earlier, but there's other craniofacial abnormalities is another example. As is shown by that inset graph, you can see that for several species, we have a relationship of increasing incidence of malformations with increasing PCB concentration. But when you look at the whole study in its entirety and look for the consistency of responses and the level at which responses were observed, what we found is that only the most contaminated fish that you find in the primary study area are at levels that would cause us an incidence of concern. So we're close, we're right at that borderline, but we're not at the level of exceedance that we see for some other receptor groups. GE did a study of the largemouth bass population structure and showed that there is largemouth bass reproduction occurring in the river. And these two things aren't really at odds with one another. It's entirely conceivable that you could have a low-level impact to some of the juvenile fish that just isn't exerting an impact at the population under the current conditions. Switching now back up to a more high-risk species. The graph here shows a combination of two types of data. The blue symbols in behind are an aggregation of literature studies done on mink for the type of PCBs that we have in our system. The big red symbols are the results of a site-specific feeding study that was done with captive mink, where they were fed actual Housatonic river fish at low concentration increments, and they were monitored for reproduction. Now, we did not test really high levels of PCBs in the captive mink, and one of the reasons for that is that the levels of PCBs above our test level, if they were up, for example, in that level of the oval range, we've got pretty clear evidence that that's a very high level of effect, and in fact, the contractor said that that would cause significant direct mortality to the adult mink. So that for a animal welfare perspective, that wasn't done. But even at the levels tested, we see that there's over a 40% impact in the highest exposure level, which is an ecologically significant level of response. And you can see that the the captive feeding mink tests are in reasonable agreement with the literature results. Perhaps more importantly than that is that the field monitoring in the rest of river system showed very few signs of mink, nowhere near what should be there based on the habitat quality that you see. And the same could be said for otter. So we have good correspondence between our toxicity line of evidence and our field line of evidence. Other mammals were assessed. I've mentioned a couple of the birds, so let's mix it up and go back to mammals. The northern short-tailed shrew was evaluated in a population demography study. Here again, you've got a concentration response relationship. In this case, it's a little weaker. You could get into a protracted debate, and in fact there has been one, about whether or not that relationship is statistically significant, ecologically meaningful, of a significant effect size. But if you just simplify it and look at it at face value, it's in that ballpark, borderline significance. And so the overall risk to other mammals, including shrews, but also other animals, is moderate. So I haven't touched on every single receptor, nor do I wish to, but this figure really crystallizes many, many binders of information into one slide. So let me explain it. Each major receptor group is listed along the left-hand side. We've talked about some of these. And then there's the three lines of evidence that hopefully now you're quite familiar with. The colors in this plot show the magnitude of risk indicated by the studies in their entirety. In many cases, like with the benthic invertebrate toxicity, there must have been about a dozen toxicity endpoints that were used to make that red determination. The number of stars that's shown in each cell represents the overall weighting, which I can probably express as being a degree of the rigor, reliability, quality of the study. There was about a dozen endpoints that were put together. We called them attributes, but that's just lingo. What it really boils down to is how much stock can you put in that study? And the more stars, the more reliable and the more weight you put into it. The last thing we did is we applied a formalized procedure for integrating those three main lines of evidence. And when we did that, we came up with an overall risk rating. And you can see, as you would expect from what I've talked about already, there's a big range. Some receptors, like mink, invertebrates, and amphibians, have high risk. Others have pretty low risk. And the birds, insect-eating birds is one example, they had fairly low risk. And then there's some in between. I've mentioned the fish, and I've mentioned some of the insectivorous mammals as well. So overall, the take-home message is that, yes, there are risks. The magnitude of that risk in terms of an ecosystem context can't be simplified to a yes or a no. It depends on what. The final thing I wanted to mention is that everything we've done has gone through formal peer review with 7 independently selected reviewers. They did request that we make some changes. Some of them were our exposure estimates, how to filter our data, but by and large they were supportive of the conclusions in the risk assessment. Their feedback was incorporated and the risk assessment was finalized in November of 2004. And then questions?
Thank you, Gary. One question for now. Is there a significant threat for a species, example in mink, which if it was eliminated could lead to severe ecological consequences?
I'm not sure I understand the question. If the risk were eliminated,
Is there a significant threat for a species, for example, in the mink case, which if it was eliminated could lead to severe ecological consequences?
I'm going to have to guess what's meant by that. I think what's meant is by eliminating the risk to one species, would that change the structure of the communities? If now you return mink, would that suddenly have a cascading effect to other animals?
Or if you eliminate mink, from the ecosystem?
Oh, it's flipped the other way.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to repeat that the study for mink, because it was a candidate receptor, it was really intended to represent all piscivorous mammals. And otter is another good example of something that's quite similar to mink in terms of its feeding habits and prey preferences and foraging ranges and things like that. So it's not just the mink. I'd say that the data are quite compelling in terms of showing that there already is a significant demonstrative effect to the mink community. And we could also infer with fairly high confidence that other piscivorous mammals are also affected. I don't want to make a value determination about how that impairment should be viewed in an ecosystem context. I think part of that decision is actually up to you as stakeholders to express how important having piscivorous mammals in an ecosystem is to you. In terms of the cascading effects into other parts of the community, that's a really complicated question, and I'm happy to see all that outside, but I'd take up 5 minutes on it here.
Okay, a couple more questions
Sure.
have come in. Have any of the EPA studies looked at biomagnification of PCBs in the food chain? If so, what are the results? And if not, are there plans to incorporate this into future research?
Yeah, they absolutely have. One of the missing links, I guess, in our presentation is that all these pieces of technical work we've done are all connected. So input to the risk assessment was result of bioaccumulation and biomagnification assessment. So I was involved in modeling, and I was also, as I'm doing right now, talking about the wildlife perspective. The model is being used to bridge the gap between the PCBs in the sediment and the water and the what we call the abiotic, non-living parts of the ecosystem, and the tissues. And the reason why that linkage is so important is that animals like mink, and even to a greater extent otter, feed on living tissues like fish. So it's understanding the relationship between the abiotic and the biotic components of the ecosystem is very important. We definitely did include it in our assessment, and it's also part of the remedial options assessment that's currently being conducted.
Okay. Compare and contrast PCB pathways to wood ducks versus mergansers.
Wood ducks were one of the insectivorous birds that was evaluated. Mergansers, I believe, have a more fish-based diet, so they would be considered under the piscivorous birds. So compare and contrast. Wood ducks have a greater site fidelity, meaning they tend to stay closer to areas where contaminants might be elevated. That would be offset to some extent by the fact that fish concentrations are higher than the insects that the wood ducks would be eating. So what we had to do in the risk assessment, this is a good example, this is because these are both two kinds of birds, is we had to do an extrapolation from the animals that we assessed formally in the risk assessment to infer what might be happening to other animals. So you could probably dig up in the risk assessment, I can't remember what section, I can probably find it in a few minutes. There's a section that describes, given the results for our receptor, what does this mean for other species? And another animal like a merganser would be listed in there. Off the top of my head, I would say that the risk would probably be about the same.
Following remediation, are the benefits of reduced PCB concentrations actual or only theoretical? That is, has it been well demonstrated that remediation reduces the incidence of ecological toxicity effects?
Can you repeat that? That's a complex question.
Following remediation, are the benefits of reduced PCB concentrations actual or only theoretical? That is, has it been well demonstrated that remediation reduces the incidence of ecological toxicity effects?
I think the best way to answer that question is to point out that one of the approaches we used in our risk assessment was to compare, we call it an exposed condition, parts of the watershed that currently have PCBs, and compare them to nearby areas that are also within the watershed that because of their location don't have as high PCBs, but are otherwise as similar as we can get in terms of other things. By other things, I mean things like the velocity of the river, the vegetation that surrounds the site, the nature of the particle sizes, all of these physical and biological things. If you control for those things, we see that the incidence of toxicity and the incidence of field effects is greater in the PCB sediments. Therefore, if you get rid of the PCBs, all other things equal, you would go back to a reference condition.
In your studies, was there a control group considered?
Yes, there was different kinds of controls. I can't go into all of them, but there are two main kinds of controls that you use in most ecological toxicity studies. One is a true control, which is typically a laboratory control or an artificial control. I'll give an example with benthic invertebrates because it's just what I'm most comfortable with. Those experiments where you have a jar of sediment with water and you put organisms in each test vessel, you always set up what you call a negative control that has clean sediment and that is otherwise manipulated in exactly the same way as all of the other sediments. That becomes your standard for comparison. But that's only one kind of control. The preferred way of doing these tests is to do what I described a few minutes ago, which is using a field-based reference material. Each of our ecological components, we tried to find a reference site, a reference condition. Sometimes it was 3 Mile Pond, sometimes it was the west branch of the Housatonic River. It really depended on the type of study and what receptor we were dealing with. But absolutely, that's a very important part of all ecological studies, is controlling.
Okay, one last question. The remaining of the questions we'll ask as part of the panel later. What percentage of all species observed in the primary study area did you study with the detail that you applied to the mink and otter populations?
Oh, it's a small percentage just because the total number of species is in the hundreds. I'd have to get the value from the eco-characterization report. John Lordy was here giving that discussion, maybe even had those numbers in his presentation, but it's a big number, lots of wildlife types. The only animals that we were able to assess to that level of detail, there may be half a dozen or so, where you had a really detailed toxicity study, cutting edge science there, combined with a field study, combined with a rigorous analysis of the literature. Part of the reason why we have to pick our receptor types is that you can only invest so much effort into one. You really need to emphasize your work on good surrogate receptors. So, you know, it's a small percentage of the overall spectrum of wildlife species. But we think we did a good job. I feel very comfortable about the choice of species so that even if we couldn't measure a specific taxon directly, we could at least evaluate something that was close to it.
Gary, thank you for your work.
No problem.
I have a question addressed to the moderator. At times, some questions that are asked may not be specific to the current presenter's expertise. Will all the questions be reviewed by any of the presenters from any of the workshops and be answered on the website, even by multiple presenters? The answers from last night are not up. We're still looking at, I mean, the response is the response on the video. There's consistency from the answer that's given by the speaker, and if we see some other addition that could be added to support or provide more information to that, we would note it that this was being added afterwards to maintain the integrity of the response that was given at the presentation. So if it requires another presenter from another evening to take a look at that, we'll coordinate that. Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Vallue. He's the Senior Project Manager with HDR Hydroqual in Mahwah, New Jersey. Dr. Vallue is a civil engineer with over 20 years of experience in the development and application of surface water and watershed scale containment, transport, and fate models. Mark has his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan, and he has his master's and PhD in civil and environmental engineering from Colorado State University. Mark?
Thank you very much. It's real. Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here tonight and make a presentation. And I get the honor of being the last presenter of the evening. Unfortunately, my presentation will be one of the shorter ones tonight. But what I'm going to try to explain tonight is what we've done with all this data. You've seen from the previous presenters that a great number of measurements have been collected for this specific river, many different types of settings across the river, both in water, sediment, fish, and other animals. The question is, how do you use all that information to determine what's going to happen in the river in the future, over time? And at this point, across these presentations, you know, it probably seems like alphabet soup to you. You guys are getting a lot of acronyms, a lot of titles for different cleanup options, you know, corrective measures study, and some of the other stuff that's going on, natural recovery, ecological risk assessment, human health risk assessment. So I'm here to describe what we've done with some water quality and food chain models. These are the tools that have helped us try to make sense of all the data that have been collected at the site over time. And so, just to get started, we're going to define what a model is. And I realize this is a lot of words on one slide, but the biggest thing that we start with, notice, is that a model, we say that's a framework, which is a computer program. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. And all the site data, all the measurements have been collected throughout the river, both in the surface water, the sediments, the floodplain, the various animals over time. And we put these together. I'm going to explain a bit more about the framework. Framework, I mentioned, it was a computer program. But what it does is it embodies all we know about the physics of how water and sediment and PCBs move throughout the river and the associated floodplain. And this provides the exposure concentrations that are used in tandem with the human health and ecological risk assessments to help us figure out what is a safe level. And that gets back to the very first question that was asked tonight. What is a safe level when looking at things like floodplain soils? And the models are one of the tools that we have to help us figure that out. So how do models help exactly? Well, they help us organize all this data that have been collected and see trends that might otherwise be hidden. But we're going to sum up measurements and take concentration, multiply it by flow, and you can determine a load, how much is coming into the river over time. And we use this information to estimate the time to reach risk thresholds for PCBs in water, sediment, floodplain soil, and as Gary described it, all those animals, the biota, the fish, wildlife, and human health. But most importantly, as part of the ongoing corrective measures study and its revisions, the models have also been used to explore what-if alternatives to assess the likely impacts or benefits of remediation. So once you have a model, the question is, what models do we have for the Housatonic River? Well, first, we should note that EPA developed these models, and GE has used them for the corrective measures study. And there's 4 kinds of models out here. Some have very specific names, but there's one model for the watershed that tells how much water and solids are coming into the river from the outlying areas, and that's HSPF. The model that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight is something called EFDC, the Environmental Fluid Dynamics Code. That's where the acronym comes from. And this looks at how water moves through the river, how sediments are carried with that water in suspension and also along the bed, and how PCBs move with all this going through the river. There's also FCM, the food chain model, and this is something that allows us to give an exposure concentration or what's in the water or what's in the sediment, how much ends up in fish or other receptors. And there's, of course, the risk assessment models that you just heard Donna and Gary talk about in the previous presentations. I should mention that these models are based on over 15 years of data collection, and really, if you think about some of the longer-term exercises of the models that have gone on, you're going to see that it's really almost 30 years of data collection in some cases. But they've been calibrated to site conditions. That is, we've tried to use the models to get them to reproduce what we've observed at this site over a long period of time. We validated those calculations by looking at long time frame projections. And these models, also like the risk assessment models, have been subject to a peer review. So, again, maybe a lot of words in the slide, but what's going on here? How do these models work? And this is, we're representing what's going on in the sediment. How does the model make calculations in the sediment? And the analog here, the thing you need to think about, when these models are operating, there's something we call mass balance models. But it's really no different than your checking account. You're really adding up everything that's going in, all your deposits, subtracting out all your losses, all your withdrawals, to get, in this case, PCB accumulation, or in the case of your checkbook, what's your balance over time. We perform these calculations on a very fine scale and space, very frequently in time, and we're tracking in our model PCB concentrations in water, sediment, soil, etc. So I'm just going to show you, when we talk about the model, it is 4 large parts of the river, and we're going to talk about the model grid here. And the first model, part of the model, is for what Ed had described as reaches 5 and 6. They're going from the confluence of the east and west branch of the river just outside of Pittsfield on down to Woods Pond. And it includes surface water, sediment, and soil in the floodplain. It covers backwater areas in the river and the 10-year floodplain, so pretty wide path throughout the river. And if my hand is steady here, these colored boxes out here, these represent actually areas where watershed calculations were performed and inputs go to the river. And in the narrow strip that's kind of in yellow, I realize it doesn't project real well up here, but the yellow, that represents the 10-year floodplain. And where you see the blue, that represents the river itself, including Woods Pond. And we've divided the site up just into this area here into many thousands of individual little boxes where we perform these mass balance calculations. And I think there's something on the order of 9,000 compartments in the model, just in reaches 5 and 6. And once again, PCB mass balance calculations are performed in each and every one of those little boxes. But the model grid doesn't just stop at Woods Pond. There's another model that goes downstream through reaches 7 and 8. So starting from Woods Pond, we can see the model grid here as shown in the green, superimposed on top of the photos, going on down past Stockbridge, and from there all the way down to Rising Pond near Great Barrington. And I should mention too that GE had also developed additional models that were used in the corrective measure study to cover even parts of Connecticut. So the site is very well covered by these models that we've been using. So when I talk about calibration and validation, we're talking about how do you know that the model's actually working and giving you a calculation that makes sense. And it all comes back down to all those many thousands of measurements that have been collected over time at the site. And we're looking to determine model performance for a few different cases. And we had what we called a phase 1 calibration, where we were looking to determine if the model can predict things that were happening over relatively short time scales, looking at PCB behavior perhaps on the order of hours to days or maybe weeks to months. We continued the modeling exercise looking at increasingly longer periods of time. There was a second stage of calibration, what we called phase 2 calibration, where we looked at simulating a 10.5-year period. And the purpose of this was to look at intermediate timescale PCB behaviors, where we're looking at how things are changing in the river over periods of months to years or several years. And then most importantly, at the end, we went through a stage of validation. Given your model setup, can you predict what's happening in the river over a longer time period? And these are really long-term trends that we're trying to look at here, where the time scale is going from years to decades. And we should also mention, as part of this, we also evaluated the effects of an extreme storm event as well, a hurricane that had passed through, I believe, Bertha it was, in 1991. So we did also look at extreme storms. So by the time this entire process was finished, we were fairly certain that we had a reasonably operating model. I'm going to take you through some of the results right now. And this is just looking at results in surface water for Woods Pond. And you can see in the top panel of the graph that we have flow. The blue line is the model projection. There are so many measurements of stage and flow that you couldn't actually see the blue line if we were to put them on the same graph. But you can see the measurements as the black circles in the middle panel, which is for total suspended solids, and for total PCBs in water column. This is over that 14-month phase 1 calibration period that we described before. And in general, the model is designed to predict, on average, what's happening. We're trying to capture as much as we can during the storm events and trying to make sure that we're at least getting the average response of the model. But the model is still making predictions, even on pretty short time scales as well. And here we're looking at just a single storm event that was in September of 1999. And you can see, in this case, we do have the measurements for flow. So you can see the model prediction is a solid line. The various circles are the measurements. And that's flow. The middle set of panels is for total suspended solids. And the bottom panel is for total PCBs. Each one of the columns represents a different point along the river. So the East Branch at the upstream part of our model domain, down by New Lenox Road, and out in Woods Pond. So again, very close correspondence between what we have simulated in the model and what has been measured over time across the site. So we were also able to look at what's happening in the sediment bed over time. And what's presented here, you might remember one of the graphs that Ed had up in his presentation at the beginning of the evening. And each one of the little blue circles represents a measurement of sediment PCB concentrations. And the black line, the solid black line that's in the background, that represents where the PCB started, what the initial PCB concentrations were in the model for a starting point that represented 1979. And the dashed black line that's in the background, that represents where the model simulation ended up 26 years later in 2004. And again, we were fairly satisfied with this performance because we're capturing a lot of the behavior that's seen in the river. So again, a good indication that the model is performing appropriately. Moving on as well, we can look at what are the results for fish. We can compare measurements of what's been measured, PCB concentrations that have been measured in fish, as well as some of those invertebrates that Gary had spoke about. and the simulated concentrations from the model. So in this case, what we're trying to compare is the red circles, diamonds, and squares, et cetera, represent model calculated PCB concentrations. And the corresponding blue triangle, squares, and circles represent what was measured. And the closer correspondence between the red and the blue points, the better the quality of the model prediction. I should mention once here, just for different species of fish, brown bullhead, white sucker, minnows, sunfish, and largemouth bass. Again, an indication that as we move from water to sediment and into fish, that the models are performing effectively. So the end result, and this is almost the bottom line, and believe it or not, almost the end of my presentation. So yeah, here's some cheers already out there. So one of the things that we can do with the model, remember we've been performing all these mass balance calculations just like your checkbook, except we're performing this at many thousands of locations, at time scales on the order of seconds, and just accumulating those results on up over the years. So we've taken a 52-year forecast for the river, and we've just summed up all the calculations to try to figure out where PCBs are going into the river, how they're moving around within it, and where they're leaving the river. And this is looking at reaches 5 and 6. And just to point out, yes, people have asked questions, do PCBs get into the air? To a small degree, they do. On average, 1 kilogram a year of PCBs goes into the atmosphere in reach 5, and a little less than 1 goes into the air just out of Woods Pond because of its big surface area. But what's really happening in the river, there's been remediation upstream, and so you have 2 kilograms of PCBs coming in on average per year. But all those eroding banks that you heard some about last night, and you may hear more about tomorrow, we have some pretty large masses of PCBs. 14 kilograms a year are going directly into the water column through erosion along the toe of the banks. And sometimes when the toe get eroded, the entire bank fails, and you'll get an entire slump of material that what used to be on the bank, now it's sitting on the bed of the river. And some of that, through erosion and deposition, may end up getting returned to the river. And some of that erosion and diffusion, I should have said, rather than deposition, I'm just summarizing those as bed releases. That represents, on average, 17 kilograms a year going into reach 5. Some PCBs go out to the floodplain or travel through the backwater areas. But what's important is we have 12 kilograms a year going into Woods Pond. People had questions about PCB trapping efficiency. Plus, through the backwaters, just for simplicity on the slide, I called it from the floodplain, but this really represents as PCBs going through the backwater areas and then making their way into Woods Pond that way. So you have about 18 kilograms of PCBs going in, 16 kilograms of PCBs going out of Woods Pond. Now, sorry, I'm going to give you some math here, but you can compute a trap efficiency here, and it's just simply 1 minus 16 over the sum of the 12 and the 6, or 18. And so that gives you a PCB trap efficiency on the order of 10%. So as far as retaining PCBs, we're not expecting Woods Pond to be an effective PCB trap. So with that, this is the one bottom line slide. And this is actually the same slide that was in Ed's presentation. Where do the PCBs going into the river water now come from? And 7% is coming from upstream areas. The rest of it is almost equally split between bank erosion and erosion from the bed itself, erosion and diffusion from the bed. The vast majority of what's coming from the bed is in the form of erosion rather than diffusion. So, and I guess just with that, we know we had a model that was in good operating condition, that was able to accurately reproduce what we observed in what we measured out in the river. So the model has been used for a series of what-if analyses to forecast what we might have going on in the future. And these were a series of 52-year or longer simulations to estimate impacts or benefits for different remediation options. This is the subject of GE's corrective measure study, or the revised corrective measure study, I should say. And the purpose of that study is to estimate future PCB concentrations in water, sediment, soil, and fish, and to estimate PCB export in the future from areas like Woods Pond or Rising Pond on further down into Connecticut. A variety of simulations performed, including for the no action or monitored natural recovery, or MNR, situation, and various representative remediation scenarios. And what we've used the models to do, and what's been done in the corrective measures study, is to help evaluate the response of the river to each alternative. And we've included in this mix, once again, an extreme storm event, one that was even larger than Hurricane Bertha in 1991. So, again, risk, fish consumption, that's one of the major pathways here. So this is just what comes out of the corrective measures study. And we're looking at the projected PCB levels in Woods Pond fish and the various risk levels associated with those fish over time on out into the future, assuming different remedial states for the river. And the first one I would point out is kind of the tealish colored line. That represents the no action alternative, or monitored natural recovery in this case. And the various dashed lines going across, those are the risk levels. You might recall Donna from her presentation. She talked about the EPA risk range and that 10 to the minus fourth cancer risk range. And there's that 10 to the minus 6 cancer risk range. And the various other alternatives sort of stacked up, and how remediation would proceed over time for those. And what's coming out of the corrective measure study is that under a no action alternative or monitored natural recovery, basically for the foreseeable future, you are not going to ever get fish tissue concentrations down below that risk threshold of even the least stringent of 10 to the minus fourth. But perhaps if some remediation is going on, you may be able to start having fish tissue concentrations that are below risk thresholds, and that would allow some fish consumption from the river to occur. So some final thoughts for the river. And I'm just going to mention the cartoons that I have here. I have these courtesy of Dave Biedenharden. He was at the Army Corps. He retired from the Army Corps of Engineers recently. Of course, the Army Corps of Engineers has a lot of experience working with rivers. And the message that Dave always said is, you got to work with the river. You can start with a sick river and think you can do what you want to it. But if you don't work with the river, it's going to rise up and bite you, you know where. But if you work with the river, it'll be your friend. So, and that's maybe trying to tie this together to the themes from last night and looking forward to tomorrow. But with respect to the use of models and their forecasting capabilities and what we're trying to do for the Housatonic River through the corrective measure study is site data. That's the core of everything we've done. Many thousands of measurements have gone into these models and to construct them. And that we know that there are risks from PCBs. The PCBs in the river, water, sediment, and floodplain pose risks. And we know that without cleanup, that those risks will remain in place for the foreseeable future. If you go through the details of the corrective measure study, you'll see that in some cases more than 250 years in many locations. There's been over 30 years worth of data collection, and over 50 years of model projections have been run so far. In some cases, it's longer. And what we see is the end result of all this is that PCB concentrations are not necessarily changing very rapidly, and that's what we call natural recovery. They're not changing rapidly, so natural recovery is slow. And I guess that's really the take-home message here. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Mark, there's a couple of questions. When looking at long-range validation models, specifically 10-year extreme storm events, are you accounting for more frequent and violent events due to climate change in future modeling?
I think the answer to that is yes. So the real question is, are we accounting for the possibility of climate change and how that might affect the play of the sequence of events that go through the river? What we've done is we have a 26-year cycle of a hydrograph, real wet weather events that have occurred in the river. And that represents the standard case. And for these simulations, we're playing through that past cycle of real flow events that have occurred, but we're adding into it, we're inserting into the middle of it a really extreme storm event. So we have taken steps to make sure that we account for that possibility, which includes climate change, of extreme events occurring in the river.
What is the longest time period that you've modeled or required GE to model?
I'm going from memory here, so I don't want to misquote this, but I believe it was however long remediate, a minimum of 52 years of modeling, and for some alternatives that took longer to accomplish, at least 30 years beyond the end of remediation. So if it took, in a GE scenario, 50 years for remediation to occur, then the model itself would be run for 80 years. But then on top of that, GE had to take the results and extrapolate to even longer periods to help figure out how long it would take to get to risk levels. And that's why sometimes you saw that I would put the number up there that at least going on out to 250 years. Some of the projections are statistical rather than using the mass balance model, but using the mass balance model itself, it's a minimum of 52 years or 30 years past the end of remediation, whichever is needed to represent the system.
Here, a long question for you. Why do most of the presenters talk only about River to Woods Pond or as far as Great Barrington? Is there no evidence, data, modeling for Connecticut? Is Connecticut going to be forgotten in this process? Is there no concern about Connecticut fish and the people who eat them? Is there no concern for the ocean, which is the ultimate destination for the river waters and sediments, and is the ultimate ecosystem and food, water, generator, incubator for the planet?
Is it okay if I tackle a part of that? So, I mean, because there's really a lot in there. And let's start with the big thing. Is Connecticut forgotten? No. So let's take a step back. Why the focus first on to Woods Pond or perhaps to Rising Pond? One of the first graphs you guys saw tonight from Ed's presentation had the PCB concentrations in surface sediments or sediments down even to 3 feet deep across the entire site. And that graph itself, I think, came from GE's RCRA facilities investigation report. We're focusing on the areas Rising Pond and upstream back to Pittsfield because those are the areas that have higher concentrations. And within that, it's the area from Woods Pond back on up to the confluence of the east and the west branch of the river that have the highest concentrations. So our attention focuses on here tonight to focus on those areas that have the most PCBs in them. No, Connecticut is not forgotten, but I may pass to some of the other panel members and some of the, perhaps even the EPA folks to answer some of the other questions that were raised.
Okay. Has there been any modeling done that includes the assimilation of PCBs from bioremediation techniques?
I don't know how to answer that question right now, guys. I'd have to go back, take a look at the corrective measures study to get an answer to that. So I'm going to have to stick my nose in a report. So maybe we can defer that question to a little bit later, but we will try to answer it.
And finally, Mark, does the monitor natural recovery model include the effect of chemical decomposition of the PCBs?
Yes. In this case, however, the rate of any breakdown of the PCBs is so slow that it's effectively zero.
Okay, thank you. We're going to bring out the full panel. There's still, let's thank Mark. I always wanted to be Larry King. A series of questions for Gary. If fish have low to moderate risk, why is there advisory against eating fish?
I think the simplest way to answer that would be to explain the difference between exposure and effects. Fish are very important to humans and to animals like mink that eat fish. The PCBs that are carried in the fish tissue are very relevant to the assessment for those receptor groups. But the effects to the fish themselves is a completely different matter. Whether the fish is healthy or unhealthy doesn't fundamentally affect the risk assessment for the animal that consumes the fish. And that's why we evaluate different parts of the food chain. We evaluate the benthic invertebrates and the effects on them, the fish as a middle part of the food chain, and then wildlife and humans at the top part of the food chain. But the effects are very different. So it's entirely possible to have different effects at different levels of the food chain.
Okay. You said that the Resta River is not reaching its full ecological potential. Is there any river with past or current industrial activities along its bank running through communities in Massachusetts reaching its full ecological potential?
Yeah, I guess by full ecological potential, I don't mean in terms of trying to make it a pristine condition. I'm referring to what the system could be in the absence of one particular stressor, which is PCBs.
Okay. Thank you. We're not going to be here all night, but we'll get to as many of these as we can. Where can we find a list of all species observed in the primary study area compared with a list of all species you studied, compared with the subset that showed toxic effects of PCB exposure?
To do that, you have to look at two locations. The first place to start would be the Ecological Characterization Report that was done by Woodlot Associates. John Norty was here speaking about that, and I understand a number of his presentation materials actually did provide numbers of different kinds of organisms. The report itself is very comprehensive and lists out the individual animals that fall into different categories and provides profiles of them. So that's the place to get the big laundry list to start with. Then you can compare that with what we call the problem formulation sections of our risk assessment. Those sections describe which animals fall into each kind of organism type, and then identify the subsets of those organisms that we identified for detailed investigation. Then in the risk characterization part of the risk assessment, you would see of the ones that we assessed in detail, which ones showed high, moderate, and low risk. But you have to combine the eco-characterization with the risk assessment to answer that question fully.
Okay.
And those reports, by the way, are on the EPA website. They're pretty easy to find.
For Gary and Ed, what are the most recent dates of soil, sediment, and animal samples? Have you compared those with earlier samples?
If I can answer that backwards, just because I'm holding the microphone, I will tackle the living organisms, which we keep calling biota, the tissue samples. Sampling has been done since late 70s on the system. In the last decade, or 15 years, say, there was a major sampling event in the late 90s up to 2000. Since then, the tissue sampling has predominantly consisted of biennial tissue sampling for young of year. These are the juvenile fish that you find in the river. And it's been done at 2 locations in the primary study area and 2 locations downstream of Woods Pond. And we can track the time trends of the tissue concentrations in those juvenile fish. There was also, in the last 5 years, a supplemental adult fish study that can be compared to results from the earlier investigations. In terms of overall trends, there's a lot of data there, so it's tough to make a sweeping conclusion, but the best thing I could say is that overall there is a reduction in recent events, but it's a fairly flat response. So if you look at the last 10 to 15 years of data and look at the rate of decrease over time, it's not a steep change at all. We're talking decades of time between an initial concentration and when the concentration would be cut in half. That's about as much as I can do in a snapshot. So I'll turn over to Ed for the soil and sediment.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of the answer for the soil, so I won't throw out any numbers. For sediment, there was sampling in the East Branch after remediation, and that was probably 2006 or so, 2000. Maybe even 2008. Within the reaches 5 and 6, I think the most recent sediment samples might have been 2002, but I'm not positive of that number. And I don't know I don't have the answer for the soil.
Okay, keep the mic good. Is it true that if Woods Pond was cleared of PCBs, that would constitute up to 25% of the mass PCBs from Lenox to Long Island Sound?
All right, I'm interpreting that to really ask, does Woods Pond contain 25% of the mass of PCBs between Lenox and Long Island Sound? And I had numbers that I was looking for that would have included the entire Reach 5. I don't think it would be 25% if you included all of Reach 5. So the constraint of downstream of Lenox puts it into a realm that I would have to look up.
Okay. How does EPA plan to monitor the potential movement of PCBs in water or sedimentation from upstream areas to downstream areas if remediation includes dredging upstream?
Well, regardless of whether dredging was a component of a remedy, there will be monitoring that GE will conduct going into the future, monitoring in both water and sediment. So regardless of whether dredging is done.
What actions might the EPA take if such movement does take place?
That one may be addressed tomorrow evening when the discussion or the topic gets to the different remedy options.
Has such movement been shown in your modeling?
If the question is related to the effect of dredging, that is included in the model and included in all of the simulations that were done for the corrective measure study by GE. So when remediation is taking place, when dredging is taking place, there is a source of solids and PCBs that are mobilized during that activity. So it's part of the model.
Okay. Has the migration of PCBs outside the Housatonic watershed been studied by the EPA? And if so, how are our OUR PCBs impacting the global community?
I don't believe that they were not done as part of this study. I don't know if there's any other EPA study that would have looked at that, so I don't know.
For Mark and Ed, as Dr. Valou discussed, the modeling used for the river from Rising Pond and upstream is different from the modeling used below Rising Pond. Briefly, how do these modeling approaches differ, and what are the implications for EPA's understanding of the river in reaches 9 into Connecticut?
I'll try and briefly describe the modeling that was done downstream of Rising Pond to make estimates of concentrations in Connecticut. The information coming out of the model that ends at Rising Pond was used in calculations that considered the concentration of PCBs, it considered the dilution that would result from inflow of water and solids downstream of Rising Pond and between Rising Pond and the impoundments in Connecticut. And then those concentrations were related to sediment concentrations, or those calculations produced estimates of sediment concentrations in the impoundments in Connecticut.
Mark, anything you want to add to that?
No, Ed did a great job.
One more question for Ed. Several of the slides presented this evening have shown soil samples from the floodplain to have higher concentrations of PCBs than samples taken from the river. How often is this the case? What are the implications for remediation of these sections of the river?
How often is the case? I don't think I can give you a number. We'll have to look that up to compare the frequency of concentrations, of high concentrations on the floodplain to high concentrations in the sediment. So we'll answer that later.
large stack for Donna, and we'll get through as best we can. Were the exposure studies only from Garner Park to Woods Pond Dam?
No. The exposure was assessed from the confluence, Garner Park, to all the way down to Long Island Sound. For the fish, we quantified risk from the fish along Massachusetts reaches, but also Connecticut reaches. For agriculture, we looked at agricultural uses throughout, but as far as the quantitative assessment and the detailed description of farming activities, we did limit it to Massachusetts only because by the time we got down to the Massachusetts-Connecticut border, we were already at levels that weren't of concern. So rather than bulk up the risk assessment, we didn't go on and on talking about Connecticut, not out of lack of concern for Connecticut, but out of low exposure. And for the direct contact with soil and sediment, properties all along Massachusetts and also in Connecticut were screened. That risk assessment actually had two phases. So the initial screening phase was to see which parcels, which exposure areas warranted further evaluation. And Connecticut screened out, the Connecticut parcel screened out of the analysis. So you'll see Connecticut in part of the risk assessment in the phase 1 screening, but then you won't see it in the later part of the risk assessment. That's the long answer. Short answer is we considered all the way down through Connecticut.
Okay. For your studies, what was the floodplain studied, or how far outside the banks of Low River, 100-year, 50-year, especially residential?
The site has been defined as the area out to the 1 part per million PCB isopleth, total PCB isopleth, which approximates, I believe in the upper reaches approximates the 10-year floodplain, unless somebody up here wants to correct me.
Yep.
Okay.
I've been a member and an active golfer at Stockbridge Golf Club for 25 years. Have I exposed myself to higher risks than non-golfers in the area?
Okay, well, lucky you. I don't happen to recall if that's in the floodplain at all, but even if it is in the floodplain, okay, so even if the concentrations once you get down to that area are lower, and if you recall, one of the slides I put up there involved direct contact with soil, and once you get down that far, the risk really drops off. But let me just make a general comment, because I think there are a number where people say, I live here, and what's my risk? The only way for me to give you a really good answer is for us to sit down together with the report, and we point on a map, and then I look at the results. So either we do that here afterward, or we need to be in touch, and you need to give me your information so I can share that with you. I'm happy to do it. It just gets down to a level of detail where I don't have every single exposure area memorized. It has been. The risk calculations have been done, yes.
If the full fat milk from cows that eat grass in contaminated areas does not pose a cancer or non-cancer risk to humans who consume it, why does recreation in these rivers cause unacceptable non-cancer risk to humans?
So the danger of presenting a huge risk assessment in 20 minutes. The reason I said that currently operating dairy farms are okay, those dairy cows are not grazing on grass, okay? They are eating corn silage. Some of their diet is corn silage. Some of that corn silage is being grown in the floodplain, but for the most part it's not. So for backyard farms, in that case, the dairy cows could be grazing on the grass, and that's why there is some concern if a parcel was being used as a backyard farm for dairy cows. But for the current commercial dairy farms, the cows are confined. They are not grazing on the grass, and so that's the reason why the seeming inconsistency. It really isn't inconsistent.
I have a note here. I'm not sure if this was from the person who wrote the question. Yeah.
That's me. I was
That's
trying to combine questions. I'll do it later.
Okay.
Well, no, I'll go ahead and answer it, because another question was asked, GE has bought 2 farms, and the question was, if the commercial dairy is okay, then why did they buy these farms? Right. And the answer is, if they're the 2 farms, I believe they are, there's only a small fraction of the farm that's in the floodplain, a very small fraction of it used for cultivation. So if I do a risk calculation, taking that into account, of course, but also taking into account that most of the farm is outside of the floodplain, that is why the farm is okay. Why GE bought it, that's for somebody else to answer.
On the chart, is there a breakdown of the risk rates between eating fish and catch and release? Which one is represented on the chart?
So I'm not totally sure which chart, because there were a couple of charts, but I assume it's the bar chart. And that bar chart was talking about exposure to soil only. So that's somebody going down to the river and standing on the bank and going fishing. And for them, for a lot of the exposure areas, that's fine. For some, actually, I think for the angler, I think it was fine in all cases, but I can go back and check that bar plot. That did not include fish consumption, okay? The fish consumption advisory exists for a reason. If I showed you the comparable plot for fish consumption, we would see levels of concern, risk levels of concern.
So if someone only caught and released, what is the exposure? Is it real bad in the catch and release stretch? I guess you just answered that.
So the answer is it's not real bad in most locations, and I would go back to the report and just check each exposure area, and you could tell me whoever you are, if you tell me where you fish, I will go look at that specific exposure area and give you a very specific answer. But in general, most of the floodplain soil exposures, a lot of them are in many of the areas are not of concern. In some areas they are. Fish, definitely a concern.
At the boat put-ins to the river, a paddler mostly has to wade through up to 2 feet of mud, and with certain paddles, one gets soaked. Does this heighten the risks?
Right, so we looked at somebody going canoeing and getting exposed to soil, and for the soil exposure, did not see exposures of concern, but once you get into the sediment, there are some areas of concern. So unfortunately, I have to go back to the same thing I said before. You got to tell me where exactly, and I'll tell you how much of a concern it is. As I mentioned, for some of the sediment areas, particularly those upstream of Woods Pond and in Woods Pond, there are some areas where the hazard index, this measure of non-cancer toxicity, was greater than 1.
Okay. My information is anecdotal, but I understand that there has been more recent use of Woods Pond for winter fishing and considerable consumption of fish. Have you elicited this information and incorporated it in data?
We understand that Woods Pond has been popular for fishing. It was at the time we did the risk assessment as well, and so that's why we used a fish consumption rate that represents what people would be doing but for the contamination in the river, so with the intent of covering this kind of a situation.
Okay. How are PCBs accumulated into the human body? Can they be ingested through skin contact and through breathing and dust? Would excavation and I think it's treating increase airborne ingestion?
Okay, so the first part, the way PCBs get into your body, yes, you can get contaminated soil or sediment on your skin, and it's possible for some amount of the PCBs to be absorbed across your skin. Relatively small fraction, but that can happen. Also, if you get PCB contaminated media on your hands and you bring your hand to your mouth, you can accidentally ingest them. Or if you're out having a picnic and you don't get dirt on your food, you could ingest it that way. Inhalation, yes, if you're kicking up dust, you can get exposed to PCBs that are in dust as well. And there was a word, the treating, which I'm not sure.
Excavation and treating increase airborne ingestion.
Yeah, it could. Now, when you say excavation, I assume you're talking about a situation where remediation or something to that effect. And under those circumstances, I would expect that kind of exposure would be controlled. In other words, if there's an excavation going on, they're wetting down the soil or somehow controlling the exposure and possibly monitoring air to make sure that the situation is all right.
Okay, a math question for you, Donna.
Yeah.
Please help me with the math. The background risk for cancer is 1 in 4, or 0.25. EPA cleans up for a 1 and 1/1,000,000th, 1 times 10 to the minus 6 risk. Does that mean that remediation starts when the risk is increased from 0.25 to 0.25, 6 zeros, and a 1? I'm not going to try to give you the decimal point. Or 1 in 10,080, or 0.25001. What about doses? Do you want to
Yeah.
later, or do you want to address it?
No, I'll address it. I'll
Okay.
address it. Okay. So background cancer risk of 1 in 4, that sounds like a statistic. If you go to the National Cancer Institute website, you'll see some statistics there about the background cancer. And it is high. I think we think about cancer as a rare disease, and individual cancers tend to be rare, but in general, lifetime risk of getting cancer is comparatively high for most of us. Whether EP would clean up at 1 to the minus 6, I don't know. I won't speak to that, but the math is, I think there might be a couple of extra zeros, but maybe it's right. I just would have to look at it more closely. But yeah, so where EPA is drawing the line for cancer, or at least the cancer levels they would consider for cleanup, are, my understanding, is intended to be de minimis. In other words, you clean up a site because you want to leave it so that it's not contributing to our cancer risk. So that's my understanding of the intent of the cancer risk benchmarks. I'm going to change the subject a little bit to non-cancer, and to say non-cancer is a little bit different. Where you have this benchmark of exposure and then a dose or an exposure that you think is without harm. There, it's not a probability, it's not a risk, so I don't know what we're adding it to. So there, it's a different kind of analysis and a little bit trickier, and maybe the margin for error is a little bit less.
Okay. I think we're going to wrap up for tonight, and we'll get to, there really is a long stack, and we will get to these and we will put them up on the website. But I appreciate the work that the panel did to prepare for tonight. There are 2-page summaries that are in the workbook, their PowerPoints, their discussion. I appreciate the community again coming back and just, showing how important this conversation is, and it will continue tomorrow night as we move into a discussion of the alternatives, what possible restoration opportunities there are, and the different options that the EPA is looking at. So we invite you to come back tomorrow night, and thank you again.